Now, Rob, last 48 hours have been dominated by the departure of Pep Guardiola. But my first question is, we saw Michael Jordan recording a video note for Pep's departure. Were you asked to do one?
No, definitely not.
No.
His relationship with the journalists was never particularly close. Although saying that on Friday after his last pre-match press conference, he did take us into a little side room at the CFA and we had lunch and a little sort of chat with him off the camera, away from the cameras. And he kind of explained that he was never going to be close with the general sort of journalist pack that followed City. He said that he thought it was important that there was some distance there, that that he didn't want personal relationships with journalists and he didn't want journalists to have personal relationships with him, because he felt like it was important to have enough distance between us for him to get angry when he thought that we'd done something wrong, and also for us to be critical when we thought that time was necessary. So obviously waited a long time to deliver that message. We could have probably done with that on the first day that he arrived in 2016 and not his final day 10 years later. But it was nice. And, I think he'll be missed. He'll be missed by the Premier League. He'll certainly be missed by Man City. I think it's one of those grudgingly that even, fans of rival clubs will miss him a little bit. His personality, his tactical ingenuity, all that kind of thing. I think that the Premier League is poorer for him moving on.
Absolutely. Now, James, we had a piece on the site over the weekend from Olley asking whether Fergie or Guardiola were the best manager we've seen.
Oh, you're going to give me this. You're going to give me this.
Is it Ferguson? Is it Guardiola? Is it Igor Tudor? Where would you put your chips?
I mean, yeah, it's difficult not to say Ferguson, but I'm not sure that Ferguson impacted the style of football in the same way that Guardiola has. I don't think that teams, almost philosophically altered their approach to the game, going from the Premier League down to League Two, just try and play out from the back and try and emulate some of the innovation that Guardiola brought to English football. I'm not sure that happened with Ferguson. And so from that point of view, I think Guardiola has had more of an impact. If we're speaking culturally, I think Ferguson still has to remain the best. He's the winning most manager, and was it 13 Premier League titles, 26 years. I mean, that we'll never see that again. And he's very much the godfather of the Premier League era as a whole. But if we're talking from a cultural and style perspective, nobody's had the impact that Guardiola has. Not maybe Wenger a little bit, maybe Ferguson to some extent, not even Klopp. I think it's Guardiola, just purely for the fact that everybody wanted to be like him. Everybody wanted to play like the Pep Guardiola style of play. And I often had this debate actually with, I'd be interested to see where you two stand on this, that sometimes, and obviously Rob, you see City far more than I do. And a lot of journalists who watch a lot of City over the last 10 years found it quite boring at times. When they were really dominant and they were winning 4-5-0, they had 75% of the ball, a team couldn't get out. But I have to say, every time I saw them live, in their pomp when they were that good, it blew me away really, because of just how aggressive they were with their defensive line, the risk that they would take, just how they were able to utterly dominate opponents. I always enjoyed watching it, but Rob, maybe you feel very differently.
Well, I mean, just first on tactical innovation, I think you're completely right, because I was at the 2009 Champions League final. United got beat by Barcelona in Rome, and Barcelona had basically their two centre halves at goal kicks basically on the touchline, and I'd never ever seen anything like that before. And then many years later, I took over running my little boys' grassroots football team, and that's what teams were doing. So you talk about tactical innovation dripping down to, I mean, you see his innovations in League One, League Two. I watched Stockport County a lot. They play with midfield, fullbacks in midfield after Pep had started to do that. But it doesn't just drop down to League Two, it's all the way to sort of under fives, under six, under sevens football in this country. Things that he was doing in 2009 for the first time with Barcelona are now commonplace on pretty much every AstroTurf around Greater Manchester. In terms of, did I ever find it boring? No, I didn't. I think there's a risk with any kind of really dominant team that you get sick of seeing them be so dominant. Games would kick off at the Etihad Stadium and a team would get penned in for 90 minutes. And I couldn't understand why. There was never really much, right at the height of it all, there was never really much jeopardy in those home games. But people talk about, the kind of things that City team did. They went through a spell of about 3 or 4 years, maybe even longer, where their idea was just to work the ball through a low block, ping the ball across the box, and there'll be someone there at the back post. So Raheem Sterling made a City career out of that very goal. He scored, heap loads of goals just doing that. And I never got bored of seeing that, even though some people said that they did, because it was just so quick and direct and fast and exciting and just, you could kind of almost see those moves starting to take shape. And then it would be like, a couple of passes, bang, 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 the ball would be in the net at the back post. I would never, ever get bored of seeing that. And that's the kind of thing that these Pep teams did. And he did it in different ways. He had, teams he had with wingers, with Leroy Sané and Raheem Sterling. He did it with a false nine when they couldn't get Harry Kane. Everyone assumed that they wouldn't be able to play in the same way. Pep Guardiola just said, it doesn't matter, we haven't got a centre forward. We're going to play Phil Foden there or someone else there and just go through a whole season without a centre forward. And then they sign Erling Haaland and he says, we're going to have to change the way we play now. Erling wants the ball in different areas, so we have to play in this way. So like Ferguson, there were evolutions of Ferguson's team, probably about 3 teams, I reckon, that he built. Pep Guardiola was probably the same. He did it in a number of different ways. It was always fantastic football. More often than not, they won enough to win big trophies. I think what he achieved in the Premier League. And Jamie Carragher wrote a column, I'm sure you all saw it in the Telegraph, where he basically said he doesn't understand the argument that Ferguson is the best. I will never go that far. I think there's definitely a debate to be had there, but it is certainly a debate. Ferguson's, 27 years against Pep's 10. I think that's a debate where probably everyone has a side. And I actually don't think there's any wrong answer with that. I think some people prefer what Ferguson did. Some people prefer what Pep did. But it's certainly those two, for me, are the two greatest the Premier League have seen so far.
I think I have to come down on the Ferguson side here, purely for entertainment value from afar, though I imagine it was a little bit more fraught being up close, Rob, to those rollickings from him. But I guess also we've seen the season teams go full circle. So we've seen Pep go back to Donnarumma in goal, who can play the ball, renowned for playing the ball a little bit longer rather than his short game. We've also seen teams take up the so-called anti-Guardiola approach and, the rise of set pieces and whatever. It's almost as if we've gone 360 back to where we started when he first came to the Premier League. Do you think that's almost one of the biggest, possible, what am I trying to say? The biggest possible plaudits for Guardiola, in that we have almost seen football change and go back to the start again.
Yeah. And honestly, I don't think he ever shied away from those changes. The one thing that I would say about Pep is, and I've seen an awful lot of managers, and I'm sure James has as well, when good teams faced up against teams who just wanted to defend, the low blocks, and you see managers come into press conferences time and time again and go, well, but they defended in a low block. What do you expect us to do? They were camped on the edge of their box. What do you want me to do? Pep never, ever said that, ever. He said that teams are entitled to play against his team in any way that they want, and it was his job to find a way to combat it, and he did. You talk about City up under Pep. Pep is, he says it himself. He says, Pep is, I'm a million passes. And he wasn't always that. Certainly with Erling Haaland, they went long an awful lot. With Ederson in his last season, they went long to Erling Haaland because City's players were being man-marked all over the pitch. It was just a way for them to get out. It wasn't always passing out for the back and just back, basically my way or the highway. He won the Champions League in 2023 with essentially 4 centre-halves all the way across his back 4. He came in and he spent an awful lot of money on fullbacks, on Ben Mendy and also Kyle Walker, to the point where other club executives were saying, I cannot believe what Pep has done to this league. If he's paying £50 million for a right back, we can't compete with that. But at the time, the way that they were playing, those fullbacks were key really to the way that they wanted to play. But then the evolution to 2023, when they won the Champions League, took him to a point where he was having four centre-halves, four physical centre-halves across his back four, and Kyle Walker didn't start the Champions League final because it just wasn't the way that they were playing. So I think another plaudit for Pep, that he has seen every kind of evolution of football. I think, over the last 10 years, he's never moaned about what teams do to his team. He's never moaned about, ways that they've come up with combating the way that he wants to play. He's always just found a way to deal with it. And I think he actually quite enjoys that side of it. I think he would deny it when we put it to him in press conferences, because he did have a reputation of being an overthinker. People will remember the Champions League final. James, you might have been there, against Chelsea, where criticised for not picking a holding midfield player for the first time in about 40 games. And they lost, obviously. And we kind of put it to him sometimes, do you enjoy the kind of the thinking that, the tactical thinking that you get to do around it? And he would always say, no, I want it to be as simple as possible. But I do genuinely think that he was at his most happiest with his laptop on a train or a plane or at home, devising ways to kind of to combat what other teams were going to do to his teams. I genuinely think that's the biggest joy that he took away from coaching. And it was remarkable to see what his teams did again and again in different ways, in different guises. It was incredible, really. And one of those things, obviously we're still fresh off him just having said that he's leaving, but maybe in 10 years, 15 years, it's possible that we will look upon what he did in the Premier League as similar to what Johan Cruyff did for Barcelona, that kind of impact. Maybe it's only when you remove it sort of 10 and 15 years that you truly appreciate what he did.
Just on that, with Cruyff, obviously Guardiola was a disciple of Cruyff, and now we've got the other disciples doing the rounds. We've got Mikel Arteta at Arsenal. Is that also a sign of his sort of ridiculous influence? I know Ferguson had his also. We've had the class of 92 going into management. A few of them are still out there, but no one has come anywhere near the success which Arteta already has. Now, James, is that something also playing into his incredible influence and legacy on English football as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been a real sort of, for me, a really interesting dynamic of the title race this season that I tried and failed repeatedly to get Mikel Arteta to talk about. But the fact that, although that's not true, actually, there was one press conference where we were sort of saying to him, you've got this dynamic of master versus apprentice, but the fact that you two are really close friends, they've got a lot of similar ideas, but Arsenal have obviously slightly shifted the way that they are playing to be perhaps more physical than they were. And he did sort of talk about, because he loves his tennis, Arteta, and he did talk about Nadal and Federer being that kind of example of they're intense competitors, but they're also really close friends. And he sort of said, it would be a shame if that wasn't the case, that the game and the nature of that competition sort of forced an erosion in their friendship, or made them sort of compromise their pre-existing relationship in some way. Of course, you have to compromise it to some degree, but the baseline is that that huge respect has been there and always will be there. And you mentioned Ferguson. I can't think of it. Obviously there are a lot of managers players under Ferguson that came and went on to manage, but I don't remember there being a sort of two at the top like that, a master versus apprentice going for the Premier League title. And it could be the case, and obviously I think we should come on to this, about the successor and who's coming next. It does seem as though Enzo Maresca's the sort of most pressing aspect of his candidacy is that he's been in the building before. He obviously knows the Guardiola way. There are a lot of similarities in his style of football. But I also think it's a step up, clearly. What Maresca's done to go from that to potentially being the next City manager, it is a bit of a punt from the club, but you can see the component parts of it. And I think it also reflects how highly he is regarded as a coach within the game. And I don't think that's necessarily reflected among supporters. And perhaps he doesn't always communicate very well. He's quite, in that Guardiola style, as Rob was talking about earlier, he's quite guarded with the media. He doesn't tend to let us in very often. And obviously it ended very acrimoniously at Chelsea, and he was sort of painted at the time as being a guy who was difficult to manage, didn't sort of respect the setup that he was a part of, and was made out to be this volatile figure. But I covered enough Chelsea matches when he was manager, and listened to enough opposition managers talk about Maresca's Chelsea with huge respect about the way that they played, the way they were set up, and the progress that they made in that first sort of year under Maresca. When, of course, they won the Conference League. They were, all right, people can shoot holes in that, but they still won it. They won the Club World Cup. Again, you could shoot holes in that, but they did it. Qualified for the Champions League. There were real signs of a team coming together there. So I can see some of the broader reasons why they would go for Maresca. It's Rob. Obviously, everybody's kind of suggesting that it is going to be him, and I know, from people at Chelsea that there has been contact with Maresca going back many, many months. Do you think it's a done deal? Do you think there's anyone else in the frame?
No. I mean, City have been a little bit more lukewarm with responding to those inquiries than perhaps some of us were expecting. You'll remember that when Guardiola came in, that the day that Pellegrini at his press conference actually said, "Oh, I'm leaving," we literally on the way out of the press conference theatre got handed a press release saying, "Oh, and Pep Guardiola's the new manager." The transition was that smooth, and we were kind of thinking that once the timing of the Pep departure became a little bit complicated for City, but once it all kind of cleared itself up, we were expecting, or some of us were expecting, something similar. Maybe just handed a press release. Actually, on the Friday that we went in for the last press conference with Pep, we all got handed a press release, and I was expecting to turn this thing over and it's to say Enzo Maresca is the next manager, but actually it was to say that Pep was having a stand named after him, so it wasn't just as pressing to file anything. But we are expecting it to be Maresca. I think that he is not necessarily City's next destination manager, but I think they feel he is the right man for what this job entails right now, and that is succeeding someone who is almost impossible to succeed. You just mentioned there, Maresca has been in the building before. He has been an assistant to Pep. He's got existing relationships with some of those players, key players in that dressing room, the likes of Rodri, Ruben Dias, Erling Haaland, all of whom are in that leadership group, which I think is going to be key. I think City are very, very conscious that it's going to take a very specific type of manager to steady the ship now. And they did the same thing with Pellegrini when he came in. When the ownership group came in, they had Roberto Mancini, and Mancini was there to be a disruptor. He was there to go toe-to-toe with Ferguson, to point his finger in his chest on the touchline and be annoying to everyone and disrupt everything. And it became a point where that became counterproductive to City, and they went then back to Pellegrini, who was very calm, who was very measured. He was going to be boring in press conferences, but at the time, that's what they wanted, and that laid the foundation for them to then go and get Pep Guardiola. Now, I don't think that it makes any sense for City right now to go and get a Luis Enrique or a Nagelsmann or someone, because it's almost impossible to follow what Pep Guardiola has done. Maresca, though, could do it because he knows all the players. He's been there before. He's out of work. It makes a transition really, really easy. Maybe in 2 or 3 years, then they look to appoint someone like Luis Enrique, who then can take them to the next step. I think he's actually quite a clever move from City, this. And I'm sure there will be City fans. In fact, there are City fans who are looking at Maresca and going, "Oh, that's a bit underwhelming." I think there's more to it than that from City's point of view. I think they are hiring or making an appointment for the situation and not necessarily going around Europe and going, "You are the best coach, best in class, let's get you." I think they're making a very calculated and measured decision with Maresca, and I think it's very, very smart.
You've seen in the past the difficulty that it comes with replacing icons. So David Moyes with Ferguson, and sort of the Wenger succession until they hit Arteta to an extent. But do you think that Maresca's got broad enough shoulders to take that on, to take on the sort of following in that shadow? I guess, Rob, we'll start with you. Yeah.
Just on that, I mean, yes, it's a good comparison that Moyes coming in to replace Sir Alex. One of the problems that David Moyes had, he never got that dressing room on side. Ever. From the first day, they were looking at him going, "Oh, I'm not sure." And that spiraled out of control to the point where 10 months later, he was getting the sack. Now, that's not necessarily going to happen with Maresca, because the players who are very, very vocal and key in that dressing room, Diaz, Rodri, Haaland, the rest of them, will all know Maresca anyway. So that's not going to happen. And that, I think, on City's part is very, very smart. And I think just from Maresca's point of view, I mean, James will know more about him than I do. I've only sat in press conferences with him a couple of times. he is very, very self-assured. He's very, very comfortable in his own ability. He has got top-level experience now at Chelsea. Whether you think that was a success or not is up to you, but he has got it. It's not like he's coming from Leicester in the Championship straight to City and he doesn't know what's going to happen at the top of the Premier League. He does know because he's done it with Chelsea. And I think that for Maresca, it's probably too big a job to turn down. You could never, it's not ideal following Guardiola. I'm sure that in his sort of more honest moments, he would admit that. He's not going to admit that to the press, but maybe, to his close circle, he might do. But you can never turn down the chance to be manager of City and the opportunities that City will afford you. But also, he will back himself to do a good job there. And also, one of the key things, David Moyes inherited a squad at Man United that was aging. Ferdinand, Vidic, Evra, they were all out the door. Essentially, Maresca is being handed a golden ticket. It is a very, very young squad. He's got an average age of about sort of 26, 27. They've just signed Guehi and Semenyo, who are only 6 months into their City careers. You've got, Foden, Donnarumma is only 26. Kusanov, O'Reilly are very, very young still. Haaland has just signed a 10-year contract. He's not going anywhere. Again, someone else who's 25, 26. They're probably going to sign Elliot Anderson in the summer, 23, 24 years old. Essentially, he's been handed a golden ticket to go and say, this was great what we did with Pep. Go off and win yourself another Premier League title and possibly even another Champions League, which then elevates him to the next round of managers as one of the best in the world. So, he's got a fantastic chance to be very successful at City.
Just a final one on City before we move on, because I think it links the two parts of this together, and that is the 115 charges. Rob, two parts to this. Firstly, if they're found guilty, and we must say they protest their innocence, they deny all charges, how much does it taint Guardiola's legacy? And secondly, how much do you think it's impacting on the successor search? Because you mentioned a lot of big names there, Luis Enrique for one. Are these big managers necessarily going to go in to that job when they don't know what the parameters are going to be, if there's a huge fine, a transfer ban, a points deduction, something that essentially writes off the ability to win the league for a season? How much is it impacting that side of things as well?
Yeah, in terms of Guardiola's legacy, again, it's a big if. If City are found guilty and are punished, for some fans, rival fans in particular, it will taint his legacy, obviously. Guardiola, if he was sat here on this pod, which obviously he's never going to be, but if he was,
keep asking.
He would say what they did on the pitch is on the pitch. And there is no denying that the players that he had at his disposal, he had to get that success out of them. And that is not an easy thing. And I think that should be remembered. The counter argument to that is that maybe he wouldn't have had those players if there was financial wrongdoing, if that was being committed, then he wouldn't have had those players. And there were titles where, what did they beat? They won it by a point from Liverpool. I don't know how you quantify it, but Liverpool fans will look at that and go, well, if you weren't doing that, then we would have had that extra point and we would have won. And I get all that. So for a lot of fans, it will taint it. Guardiola will tell you that it was always only ever 11 against 11 on the pitch. And, he still had to coach them into that team and get that success out of them. And I think that should be remembered, whatever happens with these charges. In terms of, what happens now and did it affect them and their search? There was a point, this has obviously been going on for a long time. There was a point where us as journalists were wondering whether it was affecting players signing long-term contracts. City went for a long time without re-signing players to long contracts. They obviously went through that window before last season where they didn't really sign anyone and people were sort of to wonder whether that was impacting their recruitment. City, that's stopped now. Erling Haaland has signed for 10 years. They've signed Semenyo and Guehi. They've signed Donnarumma. You imagine that if any of those players thought for a second there was a chance that they may be playing outside of the Premier League, they wouldn't have committed their future to Man City. I guess, though, the overriding thing about all of this is that we just don't know. And again, anyone that tells you that they do know doesn't, because no one is saying anything about what is happening with these charges, when we may get a verdict, what may be in that verdict, whether they've been found guilty or not. City have always protested their innocence pretty rigorously to the point where they think that they are going to be proved completely innocent and this is all going to go away. nobody knows what the outcome of these charges. The reverberations of what is going to happen are monumental, and I won't even begin to kind of guess what may happen, because it is going to be that big. One way or the other, whether they get found guilty or not, whether it goes away or doesn't. Either way, this is going to be huge when it does finally come.